It's one of the biggest questions of World War II. How on earth do sworn enemies, we're talking a full-on capitalist democracy and a communist dictatorship, team up to win the biggest war in history? And then, how did they go from being allies back to enemies almost overnight, kicking off a global standoff that lasted for 50 years? Let's unpack one of the most consequential and strangest partnerships ever formed.
We're talking about the Grand Alliance, of course, and it's one of history's most fragile and fascinating team-ups. The core question really is simple. How did this insane roller coaster ride of a relationship, from bitter rivals to crucial allies, and right back to rivals again, actually happen? The answer, as we'll see, would completely reshape the world as we know it. Okay, so first things first, let's be clear, this alliance was never about friendship. Not even close. It was a classic marriage of convenience. On one side, you had the United States and Great Britain, who were all about democracy and free market capitalism. On the other side, you had the Soviet Union, a one-party state built entirely on communism. The only thing, and I mean the only thing, that could possibly bring these two polar opposites to the same table was a mutual existential threat: Nazi Germany. To really get why this alliance was so shaky from day one, you have to understand just how fundamentally different their visions for the world were. And this wasn't just some minor disagreement on policy. No, this was a deep, unbridgeable chasm between their core beliefs.
So for the Americans and the British, their post-war vision was all about capitalism. They pictured this open-world economy where free trade could flow between democratic nations. The core values were individual freedom, freedom of choice, the ability for people to own property, start their own businesses, and elect their own leaders. And the Soviet vision? Well, it was the complete opposite. Under communism, the state controlled everything: all property, all industry, pretty much every aspect of a person's life. It was a one-party dictatorship that truly believed capitalism was an evil that had to be destroyed, and that a global communist revolution was not just a goal, but an inevitability. There was simply no room for compromise here. And this quote, wow, it just brilliantly illustrates the real-world difference. This comes from the famous kitchen debate in 1959. Nixon was basically showing off American consumer prosperity, things like washing machines and TVs that an ordinary worker could own. For the West, success meant a better standard of living. But for the Soviets, as Khrushchev's response made clear, success was measured in military might, the strength of their rockets. So even as they were fighting side by side against a common enemy, these deep-seated differences created this constant underlying tension. And that tension really started to bubble up to the surface during their big wartime strategy conferences. You can really track the whole breakdown of the alliance across these three key meetings. In Tehran, back in '43, it was pretty straightforward. The focus was all military strategy. But then you get to Yalta in early 1945. Victory is in sight, and the big question becomes, okay, what happens next? This is where their opposing worldviews really started to collide, and it set the stage for the final complete fracture at Potsdam, just a few months later. And the biggest sticking point, the one that really showed the cracks, was Poland. Roosevelt and Churchill were pushing hard for free and fair elections, a right that had been promised to all nations. But Stalin, whose country had been invaded through Poland twice in 30 years, was not having it. He was adamant. He demanded a friendly, pro-Soviet government to act as a buffer zone against any future attacks. To the West, this looked like a blatant, broken promise, a land grab. But to Stalin, it was a non-negotiable matter of national security.
And in the end, Stalin got his way. Pro-communist governments were installed all across Eastern Europe. And about a year later, Winston Churchill gave this new reality a name. In a famous speech, he declared that an Iron Curtain had descended, a powerful image that perfectly captured a Europe now split right into a three capitalist West and a Soviet-dominated communist East. Which brings us to the critical question, right? The entire point of the Grand Alliance was to defeat Nazi Germany. So, what happens when that common enemy is finally gone? What holds you together then? The final conference was held at Potsdam in July of 1945. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over,
And those cracks that appeared at Yalta, well, they were about to become a chasm. Now, a huge factor in this final breakdown was the change in American leadership. President Roosevelt, who genuinely believed he could build a working relationship with Stalin, had died in April. His replacement, Harry Truman, was a completely different animal. He was deeply anti-communist, way more confrontational, and had absolutely zero intention of trusting Stalin. That personality shift was massive.
But there was something else. Something else happened right as the Potsdam Conference was getting underway. An event so big, so momentous, that it would change the balance of global power forever and introduce a new, absolutely terrifying element to this rivalry. On July 16, 1945, out in the New Mexico desert, the United States successfully tested the world's first atomic bomb. The nuclear age had just begun.
So get this. At Potsdam, Truman casually tells Stalin that the U.S. has a new weapon of unusual destructive force. Stalin, being Stalin, played it cool, pretended not to be all that concerned. But secretly, he immediately ordered his own scientists to go full speed ahead on their own bomb program. Just like that, America's brief atomic monopoly had kicked off the nuclear arms race, the terrifying heart of the coming Cold War.
So at Potsdam, every single major issue became a total dead end. On Germany's future, the West wanted to rebuild it. The Soviets wanted to punish it with massive reparations. On Eastern Europe, the West demanded free elections. Stalin cemented his control and built his buffer zone. And with the atomic bomb, America's attempt to keep its trump card just started a terrifying new arms race. On every front, there was just total gridlock. The alliance was officially dead.
So the end of World War II didn't bring peace. Not at all. Instead, the collapse of the Grand Alliance immediately gave way to a new kind of global conflict, a Cold War. A war fought not with armies on a battlefield, but with ideology, with espionage, with proxy wars, and with the constant, terrifying threat of nuclear annihilation.
And that right there is why this matters so much. The Grand Alliance was, in the end, a temporary truce between two completely irreconcilable ideologies. It was just strong enough to defeat fascism, but it was way too fragile to ever survive the peace. Its collapse created the divided post-war world we lived in for the next half-century.
So it really leaves us with a fascinating question to chew on. Was the alliance a necessary evil that literally saved the world? Or did it just postpone an inevitable conflict between two competing superpowers? And what does it teach us today about the risks and rewards of teaming up with those we don't trust?